adventures in surveying the Wolli Creek data. So we've had bird surveys going on for years. And so every year for the last few years, I've been getting some students from Macquarie Uni, from the PACE program, to come and do some work experience and see what we can find out of the data. We found a few interesting things over time. I'd like to begin, of course, by making an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to elders, past, present and future, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. We particularly remember the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the Wolli Creek Valley. Now, as I said, it's a work experience subject for Macquarie Uni undergraduate students. So we're conducting experiments to see what we can find. They are doing a statistical subject, but this is their first experience of statistics, although they've done lots of mathematics. And so we're trying to see what we can find of statistical significance in the data. Okay, so the data is pretty interesting. The top part is the surveys that were done by Neil Rankin in the 20th century. So he started occasionally, he lived in Wolli Creek Valley, and he started sort of fairly casually. And then when I think he retired in about 1985 or something or so, but from about 1980, he started doing fairly serious surveys. So the orange line is the number of species that he observed each year. So each point is a year. The blue line underneath is the number of surveys that he did. So when we looked at the numbers, so we're looking at like 20 years worth of data, he did over 5,500 surveys in total. So that meant that he did like sort of, he was out almost every day, over 280 days a year, or did 280 surveys a year and saw somewhere between 4 and 5 birds. So that's why the lines are fairly close to each other. In the 21st century, so Neil passed away in 2000, and then after 2007, a number of teams got together and started doing more formal surveys, fixed route searches in the valley. At one stage, we had, I think, 10 teams going. It has fluctuated a bit over time. And so that, as you can see, there's been a relatively smooth number of surveys being done. So about 68 surveys a year. These groups went out once a month and did a survey once a month. And so that there's a lot more observations than surveys. There's quite a big gap. So they average something like 18 or 19 birds for each survey. So in a way, we're not really comparing apples with apples. Doug's survey, why do I keep saying Doug? Oh, because the screen's up there showing Doug Benson. I don't know why. So Neil's survey method was quite different from the method that we're using now. So I'm not entirely sure how valid the comparison is between the two sets of data. But we're doing the best we can with the data that we've got. Now, the other thing is Neil only surveyed, so Neil only surveyed in the eastern part of Wolli Creek. He did one survey in the west, but that was all. Other than that, it was all in the east. And he also did surveys in Barton Park and Arncliffe Park. And now we've got surveys as well as in the eastern part of the valley. We've also got a number of surveys in the western part of the valley. So for our purposes of comparison, we're just working with Neil's surveys in the eastern part of the valley and also our surveys in the eastern part of the valley. Now, obviously, there's holes in the surveys where people didn't get out. One thing and another happened. Teams sort of, it all got too difficult. We had a few teams kind of retire every now and then, and new teams start up. And so we're just using Eastern Wolli, and we're adding across the whole of Eastern Wolli in order to try to sort of fill in the gaps and have sort of a reasonably good coverage across that area. Okay, now this is a lovely old map that Les Robinson drew in, was it back in the days when the Wolli Creek people were trying to fight off the motorway Mark 1. And it's the clearest map that I could find. All those lovely sort of Google Maps and things have got so much stuff on them. And so it's a way of showing. So Girraween Park, this is our survey areas from the 21st century. Girraween Park is this big area down below the Earlwood Shopping Centre, and it goes down to what's known as the old swimming pool, and there's a flight of metal stairs just there. And what's referred to as the Nanny Goat Hill area takes from there, and it goes down to the middle of Torella Reserve, where Torella Creek has now been excavated, and it's running down there. So we're debating whether we should try and rename it as Torella West or something like that, because it does cover a lot more than just Nanny Goat Hill. The next area is the Undercliff Track, which takes from there, goes all through past where Judy used to live, Jackson Place, through the bush, and comes down to the infamous SWUS, the sewer aqueduct. And then Waterworth Park takes over from there and includes all of the Waterworth Park, which isn't actually part of the regional park. Then we've also got Coolabah Reserve over here, which takes in the end of Bardwell Creek. So it's quite a much smaller area than the others. I'm not sure, Doug, there's names but I'm not sure where Doug actually surveyed. He didn't keep any records of sort of what his survey routes were and whether they were consistent or what. So we're really not too sure. Now, going back to, I started these exercises in 2020 with the students. So the first year, we were really just struggling to get the data sorted out, trying to figure out what was there, what we could do. And one of the things that they came up with was this list of the top 20 birds. Now, in the 20th century, you can see that there were quite a number of foreign birds, imports from other countries, but there were 5 small birds. So small birds have been with us. In the 21st century, we're now up to 8 small birds, and we've got rid of most of the foreigners. So that's some good news. We're making some kind of progress. The next year, we tried to look at seasonality. Now, we had a bit of a problem with seasonality because we sort of don't really have enough data, particularly on the seasonal birds. As you can see, the Channel-bill cuckoo, we only have like one recording here and there on the whole, so that what we discovered certainly wasn't statistically significant. But the students came up with this interesting concept of the heat map, so that it showed, the number of occurrences that were seen in any particular month and any year. And so it showed that, yes, the Channel-bill cuckoo, we all love the Channel-bill cuckoo, don't we? They turned up at the beginning of September this year, certainly at my place. And it does seem as though they are coming a bit earlier and they're staying a bit longer, which, for whatever reason, we won't argue with that if that's what they want to do. Then in 2022, we combined with the Cooks River people and tried to do a comparison and do some investigation on the impact of the La Nina, the 3-year La Nina that we'd had. Now, we didn't get very far with that because, again, we didn't have a whole lot of data. The Cooks River people only just started surveying in 2017, so we only had a few years' data to look at. And also, the effects of the weather aren't really immediate, and the students tended to be looking for immediate effects, doing correlations on each month and saying, well, we're not seeing any correlation. And so the main thing that we found was the huge difference in bird population, the top 20 birds, or the top 10 in this case, between the two valleys. So Wolli Creek being largely bush, we've got quite a lot of bush-type birds. Cooks River is much more open and you have immediate access to the river. So you've got obviously more water birds. So we thought that was kind of interesting. Yeah. Okay. Now, this year. Okay. So in honour of Judy Finlayson, who always used to say, where have all the small birds gone? We decided that this year we would focus on the small birds and see what's going on. So first of all, a small bird is something that has a beak to tail length of less than 25 centimetres. And we found 56 such species across all of our data. This is across Neil Rankin's data, the 20th century and 21st century, just for the eastern walleye. So we're not looking at western walleye data anymore at this point. Now, I had the theory that there were, in fact, some small birds that were surviving extremely well and prospering, and that there were others who weren't doing so well. So we did a fair bit of playing around with numbers and research and statistics and ratios to try to work out how to group the birds together. And in the end, I said, hey, let's just keep it simple. Let's just look at the occurrences in the 21st century and say that's what we're seeing now. And then we'll go back from that and look at what was it like in the 20th century and earlier part of this century, what's actually been happening. So we came up with 4 sets of data. The first set was the ones that were present in the 20th century, but not in the 21st century, the ones that disappeared. So we christened them the mythicals. There's 9 of them. And looking, these dots are the actual occurrences each year for the different species. Neil only recorded the fact that he saw the bird. He didn't record how many he saw. So, and that's the occurrence. So we can only work on occurrence. We can't work on abundance for the 20th century data. So we're just sticking to occurrence. Now, looking at it, you can see that most of these mythical birds weren't around very much anyway. The only one that was sort of fairly common are these blue dots, which is the Australian pipit, or Richard's pipit, I think it was called at the time. And it disappeared quite suddenly, which rather fits in with the story I was told that they hung about in some reed beds along the edge of Torella Reserve. And then some well-meaning bush regenerators said, these reeds are not natives, so they ripped them all out. I don't know whether it's true or not, but that's the story I was told.
Definitely not true.
Okay, thank you. Right, anyway, for some reason, they disappeared. Yeah. Okay, so the next group that we said was the ones that, when I looked at the occurrences for the 21st century, there was quite a distinct break of sort of, a maximum of 16, and then the next ones were over 20. So I said, okay, we'll take this and say, these are the ones we don't see very often. So we'll call them the battlers, the ones that are the little Aussie battlers that are hanging in there, but not doing too well. So there's 25 of them. And the good news is there's 7 new ones that Neil didn't see. That's these ones that shows NA under the 20th century. So these are arranged in alphabetical order. They're not arranged in occurrence order or anything. So we did the same thing with making our scatter diagram. And again, we can see that there was, what was this? The golden-headed cisticola was around fairly commonly in Neil's day. And it seems to have sort of largely disappeared since then. But otherwise, again, these birds weren't very common, and they seem to be possibly somewhat less common now. But bear in mind, we have far fewer surveys now than we did in Neil's day. So we're not sure whether this data is really meaningful or not. Then the next group is the occurrences between 20 and 100. Again, the numbers were sort of fairly clear. And we got 9 of these, including the variegated fairy wren, which Neil had never seen. So that's kind of nice, something that popped up. So we called these ones the survivors. They're doing better than the battlers, but they're still not doing really well. So again, when we look at Neil's data, I mean, some of them were actually off the chart. So they were around a lot more in Neil's day than they are now, or so it would seem. but there's no particularly obvious patterns of some species or other species. So we're not sure what's going on there. We just noted that. And then the last lot, of course, the urban dwellers. These are the ones that I figured that must have existed. They've occurred more than 120 times in the 21st century. And so, yeah, they're the ones that everybody's come to know and love. We've probably all seen them at one time and another in the valley, probably seen them quite often in some cases. So again, if we look at the scatter diagram, I was looking at this and thinking that actually looks rather like the original graph we had, which was the total occurrences, where there was a big dip down here and it rose up again, and there's a big peak here in the 21st century. So these birds are making quite a significant contribution to the bird population of the valley. But again, there's no obvious patterns in terms of species or what they're doing. So we decided we better do something a bit more sophisticated than just looking at the occurrences. So we took a leaf out of Neil's book. He worked out frequencies. The frequency was the number of occurrences compared to the number of surveys. And so that's what these graphs are. So for the urban birds, you can see it's fairly similar, or similar at least to the scatter diagrams. And the urban birds are far more common than the survivors and the battlers. In fact, the survivors and the battlers, it's a bit hard to tell the difference. They're all fairly close down there when we look at the actual frequencies. They're not occurring too often. Now, this peak here is a bit strange, and this is one of the problems with doing a frequency. It's better than just doing occurrences, but you can still get anomalies. And this actually, I'm told, was a result of there being a relatively small number of surveys or something. There was some slightly odd reason why there's this big high peak, which looks a bit odd. But yeah, so the urban birds are sort of hanging in there. These seem to be probably increasing in numbers, and the others are just not doing so well. Now, we also decided to look at the predators, our friendly neighbourhood predators. So we took the predators being magpies, ravens, butcherbird, and currawong. And so that's the red line. Now, the predators, although everyone keeps telling me there's more and more predators, the number hasn't actually increased that incredibly much. It wobbled about a bit here in Neil's day, but it hasn't increased enormously since then. And the black line down here is the noisy miners. Now, the noisy miners only started appearing in about 1990s. Before that, there was only a very occasional one. And since then, they have built up. You can see that line does slope up slightly. But then once they arrived, they sort of arrived in vast numbers and just seem to have stayed in vast numbers. They're like that, I guess. So again, there doesn't seem to be any obvious impact of the predators on our little birds, which is curious. We thought there might be because, after all, that's what predators eat. So the next thing we tried was, well, let's look at the outside impacts that might be happening in the valley. So Rod spent ages trawling through websites and documents of one sort and another and put this list together of things that have happened. So obviously there's been quite a bit of bush regeneration. There's been bush regeneration going on most of the time. Again, this is only looking at the eastern part of the Wolli Creek Valley. So there's been quite a bit of bush regeneration going on. There have also been a number of fires. Small fires happened, mainly in the Girraween area. Now, some of those have actually been beneficial because it was a good regeneration of grasses and native species. And Paul Ibbotson commented that it cleared a lot of the rubbish and he was able to get in and do some weeding and do some bush regeneration. So fires aren't necessarily a bad thing. This one turned out not to be so good, the ones in that period. And, of course, the other thing that's, well, the weather, we've had a couple of La Niñas, and we've also had a drought in 2017-18. And then the other things that aren't coloured in are the construction works, building works, the third runway, the high-rise suburb of Wolli Creek, which went on for 7 years, the motorway being built, railway stations being built, things that created a lot of noise and a lot of disturbance of one sort or another. So we're not quite sure on what some of them you'd say, well, yes, they'd be likely to have a bad impact. So we just had a look. We tried to match up these events with our little graph. So we couldn't put everything on the one graph because it just got too messy. So we started with looking at the external events, the things like building work. So we see in here from 1994 up till 2000, the airport runway, the Wolli Creek suburb was being built, the new train line was being built. So that might have something to do with this big dip. We're not quite sure. We've got to go back and have a look because there are a number of things happening at the same time. But yeah, that's not a good look, that big dip there. The other things don't seem to have had quite so much effect. These things from 2020 to 2022, I'm not quite sure what there are a number of things that happened at that point that may have had some impact. And then 2018 was the redesign of Waterworth Park. 2011 was, that was when the nesting boxes were put in. So hopefully that would have some good effect, if anything. I think it might have done. Some of the birds might have taken up residence in the nesting boxes. And 2009 was landscaping over in Gough Whitlam Park. So it's hard to tell for sure. We need to do some more accurate calculations as to see if there is any actual effect. Then the fires, as I said, some of them caused good bush regeneration, so that might actually be associated with this peak. And then some other things were not so satisfactory. And the weather events, like good old La Nina, again, there doesn't seem to be much effect. And this is what we found a couple of years ago with the other students that were looking at weather effects. It didn't have much effect on the small birds because obviously they can go and hide down in the bush, and so they seem to be not too much affected. Even the drought didn't sort of affect them that much in 2018. The water birds were much more affected by La Nina than the little birds were. And then the bush regeneration. Well, bush regeneration has been going on pretty constantly. For some reason, we've only got records up to 2017. I know there's been a lot more work happening since then. But yeah, so we can't really say whether it's having any direct impact or not. We could possibly look at sort of particular areas, particular sites that we're surveying, and look at the bush regeneration that's happening in that site and see if there's an impact. But we haven't really found anything much yet. Okay, so in conclusion, I think my theory that there's a group of urban birds among the small birds seems to be sort of pretty well justified. I mean, urban birds is a very popular sort of expression these days, that some birds are really loving living in the city. The grouping of survivors and battlers is not so clear whether there is actually a distinction. As I said, the predators and noisy miners don't seem to have had a whole lot of impact. Major construction works in the late 20th century may have had some impact. Major weather events don't seem to. So we need to do some further investigation. We've got the whole rest of the term yet. So we need to do some more investigation using some more sophisticated techniques. So, as I said, for the rest of the semester, we're going to be using some more sophisticated techniques. We'll continue looking at Eastern Walleye. We will start looking at abundance, which we have got for the 21st century, and see what that tells us. Because when we're looking at the actual numbers of birds seen, as well as just, hey, this bird was there, we might get something quite different in our results. This is an interim result. We might have time to look at some individual species and individual sites. We'll see how we go. And for the future, It would be nice to be able to do some studies on breeding, but we don't really have much information. So that would require the surveyors to make a really concerted effort to record stuff about breeding. Anne Fardell, the coordinator of the bird surveyors, is looking into setting up some discussions with the birdos and some training. So we might look into doing that perhaps in a couple of years' time.